I'm Jacquie Gering, and today it's all about the alternate grid. You know, as quilters, we tend to use that nice row and column grid to put our blocks together. And when we're working with blocks, we can actually change up the grid a little bit to create all sorts of unique and quirky, fun quilting designs. So I brought two kind of traditional pineapple blocks, though they're improv pieced, but notice how I've put them together kind of like we would on a traditional grid. What I look at when I put my blocks together is the spaces that are formed between the blocks. And that's a really lovely space, but it's pretty traditional. So I took those pineapple blocks and I offset them just a few inches, and look at the difference that that shape can be created within those blocks. It's quirky, it's fun. This is only a 4-block quilt, but it uses that concept of the alternate grid. So let's look closely at what that alternate grid is like. So this is our traditional grid, rows and columns, pretty straight, works great for a lot of blocks. We can take that traditional grid, put it on point, and we have something that looks like this, and that changes up our blocks a little bit. But let's go alternate grid. So that looks like kind of a grid, right? Except notice that the blocks are rotated, and I've put sashing strips in between. And just that little tiny change can make a big difference. Here, I've offset the grid. So just a little bit at the top and bottom, changing those blocks directionally changes the look of your quilt. That one looks a little different, right? Diagonal set with some negative space. Those blocks are clustered, again with some negative space, rotated, creating interesting designs. Traditional medallion, rotated blocks. Now, let's look at the difference that that really makes. This is a simple block that I designed called the pointed block. So let's look. Oops, now that's not supposed to be there. Here we go. That is a straight set with that pointed block. Beautiful quilt, but look at the difference that adding those vertical sashing strips can do. Look at this one. I've set those on a diagonal. It's a totally different quilt. Look at this one. I've paired those blocks and rotated them to create this interesting shape and put them on the diagonal. Same block with those rotated blocks together, some negative space here, one simple column kind of gives that minimalist look. I took those columns, doubled them, and offset them, and again, creating different shapes down the center of that quilt. Here's that on point set, changing the background fabric. That doesn't even look like the same block, does it? And here's that medallion, this time using sashing strips in between those blocks. And here's the same, look at that when they come close together and are offset asymmetrically with background fabric. I can do so many things with the alternate grid. So when I work with my blocks, and we love to work with blocks as quilters, I actually make them on paper with this lovely craft foam, and it allows me to play with grid positioning. Now here are those, I call them the whirl away blocks. Here are those whirl away blocks, and if I set them in this traditional setting, right? Rows, columns, and it's a cute quilt, but we have so many options. And I play with those options. I make lots of blocks so I can really kind of explore what's going to happen with these blocks when I put them on background fabric. And I found with the whirl away blocks that I like to set them apart. And once I kind of figure out what I want to do, then I make the actual blocks of the fabric and move to the design wall. So before we go to the design wall, let's play a little bit. You know, play is a really important part of design. And I want to tell you that, you know, it seems a little kindergarten to make blocks like this out of foam and paper, but I read this great book called Steal Like an Artist by Austin Kleon. And Austin has a chapter in that book called Use Your Hands. And, you know, it's funny how using a pair of scissors and cutting and using kind of those kindergarten-based materials can really ignite creativity. And I also don't have to spend time sewing and making blocks before I decide on my alternate grid design. I love foam core because it's easy, or foam core. Craft foam because it's really easy to cut and it's really inexpensive. So once I have my blocks, then I can start to manipulate them in lots of different ways. You know, I had that lovely little pinwheel design with the blocks rotated, and it was like this, right? So just a quick move by adding a little sashing, and look at that, I've expanded that pinwheel, and for me, that's really pretty. But you know what, it's not quirky enough for me yet. So I've got these blocks. So what about if I move them just enough like that to give myself a little offset? You know, I love that offset look. I'm kind of an asymmetrical girl, and for me, that's a little bit more interesting. So I love the four together, but do I really want kind of that consistent 4-block look? Maybe not. So let's move those a little bit. And I'm gonna keep the offset because I really kind of like that offset look. But what do I do on the edges? So playing with those blocks, well, so that kind of doesn't work, does it? That's the great thing about play. I don't have to rip any seams, I just rotate. So what if I have kind of a half pinwheel on the edges? And with the alternate grid, it's all about filling in with fabric to kind of accomplish that quirky look. And so I've got space here, right? And I've got space here. So those are gonna have to be pieces of background fabric that I'm gonna fill in. So I'm kind of liking that look. And if it repeats over and over, I'm gonna get some great movement. And so now that I kind of have an idea, so I'm ready to go to the design wall and work with actual fabric. I have these whirl away blocks made, and I played with them with my foam and my paper, and I decided that I love that kind of offset look. So let's put them up on the design wall and kind of show you what that's gonna look like. Isn't that a pretty color? So I decided on some sashing strips to pull those blocks apart. Let's do just row 1 here. There we go. So there's my row 1, and just by adding these sashing strips, I've pulled these little whirl away blocks apart so they have a different look. Let's put up row 2. Notice this time, I'm putting a larger piece of background fabric here so that that's gonna shift the entire row over. So let's put these up. There we go. Oh, and you know, I think that's the wrong direction. There we go. And another sashing strip. And put that block up. Can you see the kind of windmill design that's happening there? And then the end has to be that shorter piece, so I get that nice offset. And I also decided that I wanted a sashing strip in between. Look at that. Wow. So what that does is kind of create this space in between that kind of pinwheely shape, and it gives it a totally different look. I have some already sewn together. I have one last seam. Let's go to the sewing machine. We're gonna go ahead and sew because I want you to see what this quilt really is gonna look like and how that alternate grid is gonna make lots of difference. I'm gonna pull my pin cushion up here so we can get rid of these pins because you know what? It's really not good to sew over pins. There we go. You know, the really nice thing about this machine, it sews so beautifully and fast, and I love that. this is kind of a long piece, but we're gonna sew it. You can see those sashing strips that I put in there. Those are gonna make a real difference in the design of this quilt. Now I just sewed over that pin, look at me. There we go. Almost there. A couple more. Those pins are nicely out of the way. There we go. Got it. So, are you ready for a reveal? Let's look. I'm gonna use some pins here so we can pin, make sure that doesn't fall down. Let's look at that. Notice on this quilt top how these sashing strips separate and kind of make that pinwheel shape grow. The offset creates this beautiful movement on this quilt top, and it's these strips right here that move this row and move the next row over and back and forth. I get great shape, great movement with just a tiny little change. And that's the magic of the alternate grid.